By the mid-1990s, science fiction was everywhere on TV and cable channels, and the king was Star Trek. The massively successful Star Trek The Next Generation was winding down, and its cast moving on to their first feature, while the spin-off show Deep Space Nine was just starting to find its feet. Paramount, meanwhile, was getting ready to launch its own television network and needed an exciting new Star Trek series as its flagship show. Instead, we got Star Trek Voyager. Star Trek Voyager was the show whereby yawning became a common reaction to mentions of its name. It's not a terrible show for most of its run, just mostly inoffensive, bland, and often feeling like it was more of a contractual obligation rather than a show that people were psyched to be a part of.
I'm just not interested in you.
It's obviously not terrible, otherwise people wouldn't still be watching it today on streaming services in decent numbers. So let's go to the Delta Quadrant, 75 years from home.
Engage.
Debuting in early 1995, a mere 8 months after the finale of The Next Generation, and debuting midway through Deep Space Nine's third season, Voyager would forgo the syndication model of its forebears. Instead, Voyager would be the flagship series on Paramount's new UPN network in the US.
On screen.
Here in the 21st century, the thought of Voyager being the main reason you switch to a particular channel is, let's be charitable, amusing. But apparently Paramount thought people would do just that, in the same way modern studios think people will want to have 15 streaming service subscriptions at a time. That they didn't watch Voyager and UPN in huge numbers is another matter, because the network was eventually merged with Warner Brothers' own vanity channel, the WB, to give us what is now known as the CW, home to shows like Riverdale and the Arrowverse TV shows.
It would be pretty hard for us to give her a full report if we don't know how the story ends.
Excellent point.
Deep Space Nine wasn't rating as well as Paramount would have liked, so despite suggestions from Star Trek overlord Rick Berman to leave the field to Deep Space Nine for a year or so before launching another Trek, the studio was insistent on another spaceship show ASAP, and Voyager was born.
There's no difference.
Created by Berman, Michael Piller and Jerry Taylor, Voyager would go where no woman had gone before. Yeah, I went there and I kind of instantly regret that and hate myself for saying the most obvious joke. Voyager would have a female captain and would often be known to casual viewers as that show with the chick, but they weren't necessarily meaning the captain.
I don't suppose anyone here is familiar with what we're talking about.
The show's premise was promising enough to begin with. The Federation starship Voyager sets off from Deep Space Nine to chase a fugitive ship crewed by Federation rebels known as the Maquis in a region of space known as the Badlands. The Maquis organization had been introduced in Deep Space Nine's second season specifically to set them up for appearing in Voyager. Both vessels are pulled across the galaxy to the Delta Quadrant, 70,000 light years or 75 years from home, by a dying alien called their caretaker. This gives the show several big story beats at the start. The melding of the two crews into one unit, which lasted about 5 minutes, and the long voyage home, which, while it lasted 7 seasons, just felt like 75 years. Leading the starship was Captain Janeway, originally Nicole Janeway, after the short-lived casting of movie actress Geneviève Bujold. Bujold quit the show after a few days of experiencing the brutal schedule of a TV show, and a visit from a time traveller from 2015 who'd binged on every episode of Voyager on Netflix and advised her to bail. Production on the pilot was shut down while the producers went back to the casting process, and eventually Kate Mulgrew, whose previous claim to fame was originally playing Columbo's wife, joined the cast as Catherine Janeway. She shot the time traveller from 2015.
This is Catherine Janeway of the Federation ship Voyager.
Janeway was a tough captain from a science background who comes across as one of those random people you see in galleries and museums who show off their degree by lecturing their yawning friends on all of the exhibits.
I'm ordering you to come with me.
Janeway is more empathetic than other captains. She cares, so we should too. This captain would get to run the gamut, making difficult decisions and getting the crew home as quickly as possible, while also holding on to her Starfleet principles.
Maybe this is one of those decisions that the captain has to make for the entire ship.
She receives a Dear Jane letter from a boyfriend who thought she had ghosted him.
Dating in the Delta Quadrant is difficult, especially for a captain on the move.
What are you talking about?
Former Maquis rebel Chakotay becomes the first officer of the blended Voyager crew. With his Native American background often used to bring a spiritual element into the storylines, the actor who portrayed him, Robert Beltran, was not shy about loudly broadcasting negative opinions regarding his character development, the series, co-workers, the weather in Los Angeles, and that guy who cut him off on the freeway on his way to work.
For years, he struggled with his discontent.
Chakotay's role as first officer is to provide alternatives to the captain, and the writers often have him play devil's advocate or take a contrary position to Janeway in order to introduce some tension. The producers flirted with a romance between Chakotay and Janeway for some time during early seasons, but pulled back, leaving both characters free to have random flings in the Delta Quadrant, since the show was made before Tinder had an app for your tricorder.
What's his specialty?
Robert Duncan McNeil had originally been cast to reprise a role from his guest appearance on Star Trek The Next Generation, but instead played a similar character, the slightly cocky, slightly roguish pilot Tom Paris.
Behold, the Delta Flyer.
Paris as a character is meant to be the best cliched pilot anywhere, but also one who's a cliched loose phaser, who's always one cliched screw-up from ending up in the cliched brig. He even gets busted down to ensign for a spell.
I hereby reduce you to the rank of ensign.
Tom Paris is a dick.
What was that?
I never said the simulation was finished.
Excited puppy Ensign Harry Kim, played by actor Garrett Wang, was just happy to be there. That's how he was written for 7 years. Harry was always the person they cut to when they wanted a reaction shot.
Am I that predictable?
Ensign Kim was generally the crewman who was most down about being so far from home.
I was young, inexperienced, and I acted like it. Nervous about giving my opinion, hesitant to make suggestions, so I usually just kept my mouth shut.
Never got promoted above ensign despite busting his ass in a role that somehow made him part of the senior staff, and would regularly chase women but would get nowhere. The few times he does score, things turn out to be complicated. Tom Paris would constantly list all of his friend Harry's failed attempts at romance, each and every time Harry mentions a woman.
Fallen for the unattainable woman? First it was a hologram, then a Borg, and now the wrong twin. At least I'm consistent.
Tom Paris is a dick. Maquis turned chief engineer B'Elanna Torres was played by Roxanne Dawson.
We've all been distracted, Ensign. That's no excuse.
Torres, half human and half Klingon, was a character caught between two forces, her anger on the one hand, and on the same hand, her rage. Torres sometimes doesn't want to be part Klingon in certain stories,
My daughter is not going to be a Klingon warrior.
but in others she doubles down on Klingon spirituality. Either that's her personal conflict coming to the fore, or we are in a show where character development has to happen in a way that episodes don't necessarily have to be viewed in order. 2 steps forward, 1 step back.
I turned my back on everything Klingon. And now she has to pay the price.
An early, almost latent attraction to Chakotay is quickly sidelined, first by a thirsty Vulcan ensign, and later by a thirsty human ensign, Tom Paris. During her later relationship with Paris, which results in both a marriage and a child, Tom routinely invents excuses to get away from her and spend time on the holodeck, first in a bar, then a resort, then an old-timey sci-fi serial, then in a garage, then in a stereotypical Irish village, and when he wasn't cavorting with his hologram whores, he'd be chilling in sickbay, pretending to be a part-time nurse. Tom Paris is a dick.
A hologram, an ex-Borg, the wrong twin, and now a girl from a xenophobic species?
Next up is Vulcan security officer Lieutenant Tuvok, played by Tim Russ, one of the few actors playing Vulcans in a Trek series to understand the difference between stoic and wooden. It is ironic that the actor playing the most emotionally controlled character ends up being one of the more interesting to watch out of this ensemble.
I haven't completed my security rounds.
You have now.
This being Star Trek, Tuvok is the character that everyone else makes fun of because apparently if they aren't crying, it's okay to make fun of someone. Which was a bad move, because Tuvok would go a little nuts and lose his shit at least once a season.
You are not invulnerable, hologram. A few well-chosen commands to the computer, and you will cease to exist.
Tuvok, being married with children, is Voyager's only deadbeat dad.
We're having fun.
Tuvok had been undercover on Chakotay's Maquis ship, but then in hindsight it turns out that everybody was undercover on the Maquis ship. This goes some way to explaining the fractious relationship between Tuvok and Chakotay throughout the series.
Were you going to deliver us into their waiting hands, Vulcan?
My mission was to accumulate information on Maquis activities, and then deliver you into their waiting hands. That is correct.
Neelix, played by Ethan Phillips, is the sort of quark alien character, but without any edges apart from always irritating the rest of the crew.
Go on, Mr. Vulcan. It might even help you loosen up.
Neelix is the ship's cook, but not a very good one. He's morale officer, but not a very good one. And he's the ship's ambassador, but not a very good one.
You're filled with contempt and sarcasm, and I'm tired of being the target of all your hostility.
In early seasons, Talaxian Neelix is paired up romantically with the most jailbait character in Trek history, Kes.
When I first met you, I didn't know that your species only lived 8 or 9 years.
Kes is an Okumpan, a Delta Quadrant race who have a lifespan of only a few years, which was convenient because she was written out of the series after 3 years.
We might still be able to have a daughter?
Or a son.
No, a daughter. Definitely. One who looks just like you.
Kes was meant to have basic psychic abilities that grew and grew with the help of Tuvok, though the intensity of these abilities would ebb and flow based on whether the plot needed her to have a little brain magic or a lot of brain magic. Kes's other apparent story function was to make Neelix insanely jealous, particularly when she interacted with Tom Paris, who at one stage briefly admitted to falling for Kes.
Oh. To be honest, if you weren't around, I'd be knocking at her door.
Remember, folks, Tom Paris is a dick. Kes and Neelix's romance is depicted in an unusually chaste way compared to even DS9 or The Next Generation, and for whatever reasons they were quietly separated without much fanfare by the end of the 3rd season.
It might be a good idea for both of us to spend some time apart.
Kes's role in the crew was never really clear. Initially she began a garden for growing fresh vegetables, the Aponics Bay, and did some wonderful Legend of Zelda cosplay, but quickly found an aptitude in sickbay as the doctor's assistant.
And I've known him for most of my life. He's one of my closest friends.
While the doctor was training her in medicine, in reality it was Kes training the doctor to be human. By the time Kes leaves in early season 4, her brain magic would become so dangerous she would need to leave the crew, or else her brain magic would do something.
Something important is happening to me and I want to explore it. But I can't stay here any longer. I'm a danger to all of you.
Kes does return for an episode later on, where her brain magic has turned her bitter and twisted. The character leaving the show didn't work out all that well for the actress, Jennifer Lien, whose life took a somewhat difficult turn. Of course, the MVP of the show's first few years was the emergency medical hologram, the unnamed doctor, played with gusto by Robert Picardo.
Please state the nature of the medical emergency.
Why do you always have to say that?
I can only speculate about my programmer's motives. Perhaps he thought I might be summoned for important reasons?
Activated when all of Voyager's medical staff are killed in the pilot, the Doctor was initially trapped in sickbay for the first few years, until the writers either grew more confident or didn't give a flying shuttle, and he was able to go anywhere the story needed him to go.
It's possible that Mr. Paris represents a future stage in human development, although I can't say it's very attractive.
Tom Paris is a dick. His character is one of the few whose arc is well handled by the writers and the actor. Starting out prissy with a terrible bedside manner, he grew to be prissy with a little more compassion for his patients, and a massive ego that is the single biggest source of genuine laughs in the show.
Oh, it's perfectly all right, Doctor. Or do you prefer Maestro?
Please. Either is acceptable.
Of course, there is another cast member whose introduction resulted in the writing out of Kes at the start of season 4. In came reformed Borg 7 of 9, played by Jerry Ryan. Seven begins as a character who initially wants to cling to her Borgness, which she sees as perfection. She finds emotion and human interaction difficult, though with the help of the Doctor and Janeway, Seven finds a place for herself on Voyager. Though, this being Star Trek in the 1990s, that's not her costume for very long.
Fashion, of course, is hardly my forte. Nevertheless, I've managed to balance functionality and aesthetics in a pleasing enough manner.
Clad in an outfit that's part male gaze, part Instagram influencer, Ryan still owns every scene she is in.
Beauty is irrelevant.
Seven has more character development and interesting storylines in 4 seasons than most other characters got over the course of Voyager's full 7-season run.
It may not be apparent, but I am often amused by human behavior.
Seven was obviously a favourite of the writers and viewers. It is a testament to Ryan's talent that when a later Trek series tried a similar character in a clingy catsuit, the result was not nearly as impressive.
The
Because of what I did, they'll be forced to live the rest of their lives in the collective. For that, I am responsible.
Jerry Ryan's eye-catching presence brought a lot of press for the show at the expense of the other actors, a fact that caused some resentment from certain other cast members. You'd never know it from watching it, but Kate Mulgrew's hostility towards Seven apparently made Jerry Ryan hate working on the show.
Obviously, she exerts some influence.
Hey, but at least 7 of 9 appears with Patrick Stewart in Picard.
I've seen everything. You know, I've seen it all.
I've been conducting simulations to explore different aspects of my humanity.
One aspect of the travelling back to the Alpha Quadrant storyline is that the recurring villains changed as the show progressed. Whether this was a deliberate move or just as a result of the production people realising nobody cared about the initial group of aliens is unknown.
Tell him today is the day he will finally be called Ogla.
Introduced in the pilot are the Kazon. Why the Kazon look like bad Klingon cosplay is a matter for conjecture, but these are truly off-brand Klingons, the sort that you would get in Aldi, without anything that made the Klingons compelling or interesting. The plague-stricken Vidians popped up a few times throughout the show, providing a technologically advanced race of organ vampires as an alternative threat, which proved a little more scary and slightly more successful.
And I do have feelings.
We later had the Borg nemesis, species 8472, from whatever the hell fluidic space is, and the Hirogen, a race of hunters with perfect diction.
We entered this city with superior firepower against a weakened prey. Do you really deserve these prizes?
Then, as DS9 introduced the Klingons as a way to get viewers more interested in that show, Voyager began to lean heavily on the Borg as a scarier continuing threat.
Janeway.
Having a Borg on board Voyager meant we would come across the Borg and the Borg Queen on a regular basis. Ex-Borgs and Borgs who have their own version of Second Life.
Give it to me.
Voyager using the Borg more and more as an object lesson in how interesting foes do make a huge difference.
Stay focused. Stay Tuvok. That's an order.
Of course, as Voyager also struggled somewhat in the ratings,
Is anyone receiving this communication?
the show would lean even more heavily on previous Treks by first having occasional appearances by Q, then an episode that showed Tuvok as a crewman on the Excelsior during the events seen in Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country.
Mr. Tuvok,
Like the match.
And then in later years we had multiple appearances from Next Generation cast members Dwight Schultz and Marina Sirtis. Also mind-blowing are the usual raft of famous and soon-to-be famous faces appearing as guest stars, small roles and cameos, such as Michael McKean, Sarah Silverman, Ed Begley Jr., Jason Alexander, and Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, among others.
I have no desire to inflict further damage.
I'm afraid I can't say the same.
Voyager very quickly became infamous for stories involving anomalies. In fairness, anomalies had been a staple of Trek since the original series. But Voyager was the show that got stuck with the reputation for strange clouds, weird nebula, unusual phenomena, time distortions, and other cosmic aberrations that require me to use a thesaurus. The show was made in an era before serialized shows became the norm, and while DS9 had some success in short story arcs, Voyager was always hamstrung by the prevailing TV wisdom, a phrase I use with some sense of irony, which boiled down to, don't make me have to have watched every episode in order to understand what was going on. This often impacted on character development, which often amounted to 2 steps forward, 1 step back, particularly in the case of B'Elanna and 7 of 9. Romances happened along the way, with Tom and B'Elanna. Tom Paris truly is a dick. And a late blooming affair between Chakotay and Seven happening while the Doctor quietly blubbed in the corner, looking up cats available for adoption. Janeway during the course of the journey does hook up here and there, but not enough to avoid the suggestion that she avail herself of the holodeck. The implication is the holodeck is somewhere people go to have anonymous sex with holograms. And I'm betting Neelix is the one who has to clean the floor afterwards.
Security to Neelix. Cleanup required on holodeck 2.
I mean, she's not a Borg, she's not a hologram, and she's not dead. Looks like you might have finally found yourself the perfect woman.
Voyager, like most Star Trek series, has its share of highs and lows.
But suffice it to say, now that we're down, we won't be going up again soon.
The lows, with a few exceptions, weren't terrible, but the highs really weren't that exciting either. It's a fairly consistent show, but it's very safe, and when it isn't safe, you always know that somehow things will be reset at the end. Even the finale is the ultimate reset, when Janeway, having gotten the crew home, decides she didn't get them home well enough, so she deletes her current save game to try and beat her own high score.
Maybe together we can increase our odds. Maybe we can do more than that. There's got to be a way to have our cake and eat it too.
The show itself has proven to be quite popular on Netflix or Paramount Plus or other streaming services, and while Paramount has refused to have the show remastered for HD like they did with the Next Generation, Voyager is still something people care about.
Why?
And modern viewers are perhaps a little more forgiving of it than they once were.
Or maybe you've simply become as fallible as those of us who are made of flesh and blood.
Let's talk about the standout episodes. The show's pilot, The Caretaker, does a good job of setting up the situation and the characters, even though, in hindsight, most of the threads don't pan out the way the producers would have expected. It's also ironic to see this visual homage to the 1970s horror film Coma, which starred Geneviève Bujold.
Commander Chakotay and I have agreed that this should be one crew. A Starfleet crew.
Tuvix, where through a transporter accident, Neelix and Tuvok are melded into a new being, Tuvix, who manages to be more charming and personable than either of his donor people.
I've just come from the captain, and she's thinking about forcing me to go through with the separation. If anybody can make a difference, Kes, it's you.
I will not take Mr. Tuvik's life against his will.
Very well, Doctor. Please step aside.
Worst case scenario, a security training program put together by Tuvok turns out to be a popular horror novel in need of an ending.
The Chakotay hologram is undergoing some sort of character change.
Blink of an eye, where Voyager orbits a planet where time flows much faster than on the ship.
He was my son.
But you're a hologram.
It's a long story.
Deadlock, with two doomed Voyager crews trying to decide which one of them should survive.
When you were in disagreement with the other captain about...
Would I have given the order to self-destruct our ship?
Year of Hell, when time-altering aliens keep making the crew of Voyager's life harder and harder.
Target Voyager. Put Janeway out of her misery.
The Voyager Conspiracy, where Seven becomes paranoid through information overload, like when you connect with someone new on social media.
Stardate 48658. Commander Seska is revealed to be a Cardassian spy. She defects to the Kazon and impregnates herself with Chakotay's DNA. Was he unaware of the procedure as he claims, or were they working together?
Author, where the Doctor goes to court to serve a DMCA notice. And of course, most of the Borg ones are worth your time.
Alright.
The worst episode is almost no contest for most people. The Season 2 episode, Threshold, is mostly considered trash. Actually, while many will claim it as the worst, it's watchable mainly because of Robert Duncan McNeill really goes for it. What's totally unwatchable for me, and possibly one of the worst Star Trek episodes ever, is The Thaw. The less said about this monstrosity, the better. The show generally does pick up a bit in later seasons, but there's also a trend to find ways to write stories about anyone other than the crew. So we have episodes where Kate Mulgrew plays one of Janeway's ancestors, or we have an episode about Voyager's crew dying off and they turn out to be clones, or Voyager's crew induced to believe they are someone else, or Voyager's crew dying off and being restored through temporal anomalies. Or worse, having episodes set in the Alpha Quadrant with Reg Barclay and Deanna Troi. Anything other than having to write stories where Harry Kim does something. That said, there are far worse things in life than watching an episode focusing on Harry Kim. And that's watching a Chakotay episode. Even the kids, Naomi or the Borg kids or Icheb, get more interesting episodes than the First Officer. No wonder Robert Beltran wasn't so complimentary about the show. Star Trek Voyager does have one of the best theme tunes of any Star Trek series ever. Another masterpiece by the great Jerry Goldsmith. So after revisiting the series, I am revising my personal opinion from "this show is trash" to, well, if you like Star Trek, you should probably watch Voyager at some time. Janeway's a very good captain. The Doctor, Tuvok and Seven all make for entertaining episodes. B'Elanna and Tom aren't too bad either, despite the fact that Tom Paris is a dick. The show started off conceptually as Lost in Space, and for a while that phrase was often used to describe the show's critical reception. Is it the worst Trek series, or is it better than Enterprise? Does it being trapped in the standard definition Phantom Zone eventually doom it to being relegated to viewing on phones or tablets while you eat dinner or play video games? Are you still finding it hard to watch scenes with 7 of 9 without needing to stop and get a drink or turn on the air conditioning?
Is this more appropriate?
At the start of this video, you might have felt I was down on Voyager, and I suppose I was for a very long time. But I was surprised by how much I enjoyed watching Voyager again after so many years. Sure, there are a few duff episodes, and more than a few dull episodes, like any Trek, but the cast are usually quite fun to watch, even when their characters aren't always being well serviced. But at least its finale wasn't a flashback in someone else's show. Should you watch Voyager?
Do it.
Yeah, why not? Tom Paris is a dick. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, leave a comment below or check out some of our other videos.